Hello, welcome back to Sextras.
Where we talk about sex and all the extras.
I'm Honey.
And I'm Maria. Welcome to our Pleasure and Desire miniseries.
Yeah, this is our second mini-series of season 3. And we hope you enjoyed our first one, which was all about friendship. We're kind of enjoying this new format of like getting deep into a topic, hyperfixating on a topic.
Yeah, even though that might mean a couple of weeks with no episode for you guys, but it's because, you know, we want to get the juice really to come out.
Yeah. So yeah, and we're joined by like more guests because of this format as well, which is really good. We've been learning a lot from all the people we've spoken to.
100%.
And this episode, we're joined by Catherine Roach, who's a professor of gender and cultural studies at the University of Alabama. She wrote a book called Good Sex, Transforming America Through the New Gender and Sexual Revolution. So you guys should go check that out if you're interested.
Yeah, and she's been studying this for like 25 years. So we really sort of get into like more of a general idea of like sex and desire and pleasure, especially for women, around like what like the societal kind of norm and message is, and yeah, like the conversations that are being had around it and the changes that are being made.
Yeah.
And she really gave us like a really good picture, and we had a great conversation, so I hope you guys enjoy.
Yeah, and if you want to watch the episode, in case you missed this announcement in the last mini-series, we're now releasing the full video on our Patreon, so you should go over there and join. You get loads of benefits, like you'll get bonus episodes, you get a free sticker, you will get some behind the scenes, like planning, voice memo stuff.
Plus all the scenes that don't make the cut to, you know, the final audio episode, and there's like the bloopers, if you will. It's like quite a good time.
Yeah, and you'll get like a little bit more of like a community, like two-way street kind of thing. Like you can have your input and what you want us to talk about, and we'll do it. So yeah, you should definitely go over and join. It's only $3.50 a month, so it would be great if we could have a bigger community over on there. But yeah, well, let's get into the episode with Catherine. Okay, thank you so much for joining us today. Could you tell us a little bit about your book, what inspired it, what the kind of topics that you really wanted to tackle while writing it were?
Yes, and thank you for the invitation to be here today. I'm delighted to be talking with you and to tell you a little bit about my new book. So it's called Good Sex, Transforming America Through the New Gender and Sexual Revolution. It has a focus on contemporary American society, notions of how sexuality is playing out in America now, but it does have a wider reach also. I'm not an expert outside sort of the arena of North American studies, but I am thinking about the global significance of these issues also. Just got back from the UK, actually. I spent my last academic year at the University of Edinburgh on a sabbatical, a research work exchange from my University of Alabama. So this book is very dear to my heart. Of all of the books that I've written, this is the one that was most collaborative with my students. I'm a professor of gender and sexuality studies, American popular culture at the University of Alabama. And I work with undergraduate students a lot in this large, what we call a core course. So a course that serves as a liberal arts core credit for students from across the entire university. So this book emerged from that course, so what you might call a module over in the UK, teaching about sexuality and society to undergraduates from a wide range of programs. So they come to our classroom from programs of study in engineering, in fashion design, in biological sciences, in mathematics, from business school, from across the entire university. And they come to this course, and we're thinking about issues of gender and sexuality in America today, and how that's different from their parents' generation, how there's this moment of demographic shift that entails a cultural shift. So much more openness to issues of gender and sexual diversity than ever before, and much more conversation about problems of sexual assault. The Me Too movement exploding has really made a difference, and taking away sort of taboo and shame that one shouldn't even talk about these issues. So more openness, more equity, more inclusion, more diversity. Not that it's any sort of paradise by any means, but that there is this sense of a moment of change. So this book came about because the students in a smaller seminar that I had taught for many years brought this sense of need to have a curricular space to think about these issues, to think about issues of sexual trauma, but then also new openness for sexual and gender diversity and justice. And I wanted to impact the largest possible demographic group on campus. So I scaled up my small seminar into this very large lecture class. And I've been teaching it for 7 years now, the sexuality and society class. And that became the lab space for the book. So as I taught this material, and we had these really fascinating classroom conversations with this wide range of students across the entire university, so much the students themselves had so much that was really insightful and astute and oftentimes very moving. I knew that it wasn't just a classroom, but it was a research project also. So the classroom became like a lab space, and the material that emerged from the classroom discussions and the students' work found its way into the book. So the book is full of all sorts of student quotes, these little anonymous comments from the students themselves about these issues of gender and sexual change and justice in society today. So it became like a collaborative project. And although much of the material is complicated and reflects trauma, it also reflects this great sense of hope around positive cultural change. And the students themselves give endless hope for the future, this insight into an important moment of cultural shift, and a very positive sense of ideally where things can be going. So it's a book that's dear to my heart in that way. I'm delighted that it's found its way into the public realm now.
Okay, good. Could you define a little bit about like why you called it good sex? Like what is the definition of good sex? I mean, I know the book unpacks it, but where does that come from?
Yes, so I chose that title, the Good Sex title, very deliberately because I wanted to play on the dual senses that this word good carries. So a grand old word, one of the oldest words in the English language, and it carries this fascinating dual meaning of good as in moral, ethical, upright, upstanding, doing good, but then also the sense of pleasurable, satisfying desire, feeling good. So the two interplay, they intertwine in this notion of good sex that I'm talking about as part of this cultural shift, a cultural moment of transformation. So thinking about good sex in terms of positive sexuality, we're seeing more openness to a positive, sometimes called sex positivity, positive sexuality, seeing sexuality as a normal, natural part of the human condition, and people have the right to their sexual choices as long as those choices are consensual and respect partners' autonomy. So things like same-sex marriage becoming legal in America, it was in 2015, and now being ratified again by the US Congress in a bilateral vote just this past week. And increasingly around the world, more and more countries are making same-sex marriage, marriage equality enshrined in law. So good in that sense, this positive sexuality trend, making an argument about this sex positivity. So I'm interested in how that word good, there's a certain controversial, I guess, catch one's attention aspect of using the title good sex, but really to make the point that the goodness of sexuality interplays in this very closely intertwined way, the pleasure and the moral, the legal, the ethical aspects of sexuality. So that's what I'm going for there.
Okay. Do you think the whole moral and ethical side of sex kind of detracts from our pleasure in sex and like our enjoyment of sex and our outlook on sex?
Ideally, not at all. No. I do this exercise. I mean, there's more than one way I could address that question, but I'll give you an example. I do this exercise in the classroom with my students. I call it the Good Sex Story Project. So it's an optional bonus activity they can do at the end of the semester to pull up their final grade. There's a variety of optional activities they can do at the end. Write a research paper, or they can write a short piece of erotica, and that's what I call the Good Sex Story Project. So write a piece of erotica, and I tell them it can be of any sort. It can be very sweet, just this sort of smoldering glance across the room, or it can be 5-star, 5 chili pepper hot, hot and spicy, whatever they want. It can have vampires, it can have werewolves, it can be historical, sci-fi, there can be aliens, whatever they want. But there's only 2 criteria: that it's got to satisfy this good sex criteria of it's good as in moral, ethical, legal, meet the standards of full consent, full affirmative adult consent, nobody's drunk out of their mind, no vertical relationships, so no boss employee sort of thing. So good in that sense, but then also good in the sense of fully pleasurable, satisfying of desire for all partners involved. So orgasm equality, clitoracy. If there's one of the partners has a clitoris, that clitoris should be engaged in the action, right? So reciprocity of pleasure in whatever the sexual encounter or romantic encounter is that they're writing about. So those are the only criteria. It's got to be good as in ethical, fully consensual, good as in pleasurable, orgasms all around. Not that, I mean, one can be too orgasm centered in life. It's not the only definition of pleasure, right? But could well be important in sexual encounters. So fully ethical, consensual, sex. And it's actually difficult to write these scenarios. I mean, to get back to your original question, because there's so much that's, I think, sort of programmed about sexuality, and the pop culture and such uses these tropes of like the boss employee romance, I don't know, some like trope in rom-coms and such. And so, and in porn, so much of these strict scripts that we carry about sexuality program from the sort of the omnipresence of the mainstream porn undercut that notion that fully consensual sex and can be fully pleasurable and model mutuality of pleasure for all partners. So we've got to sort of work against some of the traditional and I would say old tired tropes about sexuality that are not about the equality of pleasure, that are often unconsensual, that are like rapey, really. And so we've got to like get that out of our heads, work against it, and think about, of course, fully consensual sex is sexy. Of course, it's a pathway to full pleasure for everyone. Of course, it's supportive of desire, particularly the desire of people, gender and sexual minorities, or women who have not had their desire represented in the culture, who have not been given full cultural permission to experience their own desire, to experience their bodies as desirable. And that can be people whose bodies don't match up with previous standard definitions of what counts as the sexy body, the beautiful body, the good body. So my argument intersects here with disability justice and racial justice. So white supremacy and ableism has defined the good, sexy, desirable body as young and female and fully abled and, sort of curvy and slim and curvy and busty all at the same time. So we're part of this new gender and sexual revolution is about body positivity, also body acceptance, and embracing a much wider diversity of what counts as the good, sexy, desirable body, representing that and having that enter into our definition of positive sexuality. So I think I got on a roll there and started getting off your question. But
no, it's great.
Good consensual sex, of course, is sexy and leads to, I would argue, the best narratives and imagining of the equality of pleasure and desire.
Mm.
Actually, going back to exactly what you were saying about this sort of like idealized body and like beauty standards, I guess we can call it, like how does that affect like the pleasure that we can have in like not just in like the people that we sort of like seek out and are attracted to, but also just like within ourselves?
Yeah, I think that's an excellent question and very complicated, right? It's and goes in both directions. Like we like to think, for example, that who we're attracted to, who we find sexy and desirable in the world is a matter of our own free will. Or maybe there's like this Cupid arrow thing that hits you, but we choose our partners. But if you think about notions of racism and sexism and ableism and ageism, how they work in society, it might well be that we all carry these various forms of implicit bias within us that we inculcate as we grow up, and you just are surrounded by the daily soup of pop culture and representations of the body in society, what counts as the good body. And so there's bias against certain types of bodies, and then that shapes what we find desirable. So there's a it's a pessimistic notion in that way, right? That who we could fall in love with, who we could find to be a hot, wild, sexy partner is shaped in these forces outside our control that work against justice in that way, that really narrow potential partners that we could find pleasure with and love with in life. So yeah, it's about sort of becoming aware of implicit biases that we can all carry about what counts as the good, desirable body and partner, what counts as beauty, and then going in the opposite direction, thinking about ourselves in that way too. So many of us, I see this with the students all the time, carry various forms of shame, trauma from big to small. We carry shame and taboo around inside us. It's hard to grow up. I don't know how this compares exactly in the UK versus the US, but I would say it's hard to grow up without having been made to feel bad somehow about your body. You're not doing your body right. You're not embodying your gender right. You're not acting out the scripts for masculinity or femininity appropriately. You're not doing your sexuality right. You're not ever sexy enough for the norms of the culture. And we inculcate those messages, and then we feel them deep in our body. So it's more difficult, I think, for certain groups to connect with the pleasure of their own body. Girls and women in particular are often shamed for their sexual desire. Boys can have an easier time, I think, owning that sense of their own desire. One of my students, she was writing in some final term paper just this week that she didn't know girls could have orgasms, that women could have orgasms until she was 17 years old. She thought only males had orgasms. And it's linked to the poor quality of sex education that people receive. And so boys' orgasms can be normalized in sex ed as part of a sort of human reproduction lesson, that a male ejaculates in order to send sperm into the vagina, and that's how a baby comes about, right? But so much of sex ed is completely silent about girls' pleasure and women's pleasure. So they teach about the penis as part of reproduction. They don't teach about the clitoris. Often girls have told me they didn't hear the word clitoris. They didn't know about the clitoris at all, right? This organ that's designed solely for female pleasure. There's this huge silence around it. So girls often don't know about their own sexual pleasure. They don't feel entitled to explore their own sexual pleasure, to own it. They hear the message from the pop culture and social media and visual culture that they're supposed to look sexy. They're supposed to present, groom themselves endlessly, including like shaving their pubic hair, and present a sexy exterior for the male gaze, for social approval, etc. But to feel sexy, to experience and enjoy their own sexual desire is it's a cultural lesson that's less present, and they feel less permission by the culture to explore and experience their own sexual desire, to the extent that they might not even know, that they've got a clitoris, that it's there to make their body feel good, and that women can experience orgasms too. And then all these double standards kick in, and the slut shaming that young people talk about, and it relates to problems of hookup culture on American college campuses that I think has some sort of parallel for you all in the UK. Did that answer your question? There's maybe me on another role, a rampage there. It's an important issue.
Yeah, no, for sure. I just find it like crazy how almost part of puberty for women is like the first experience of like being sexualized, you know?
Mm-hmm.
But then women don't often even find out about their own pleasure like until years and years and years later. And I'd never thought about how like the way that sex is taught is like inherently talks about like male orgasm, but women have been constantly sexualized since they like literally got their period, literally, and then don't even know like about the pleasure to be had, essentially. And
Exactly. I
it's
know
so
it's
ridiculous.
sort of this crazy paradox in the culture, right? That women's bodies are sort of constantly sexualized and used in sort of like advertising and consumer culture. The sexiness of a woman's body is used to sell all sorts of products, right? So the sexualization of the woman's
Mm.
body, of the female body, of the feminine is there everywhere in the culture. But literacy about women's sexual pleasure is often it's absent, or it's just a, I think it's a slowly growing discourse. So I'm very interested in this concept
Mm.
of cliteracy, of literacy about the clitoris, and it's not an original concept for me. It's an American artist I follow. Her name is Sophia Wallace, a conceptual artist based in New York City, and she has a decade-long project that's been ongoing in different forms about cliteracy and taking the organ of the clitoris and using it. She says she wants to create a visual vocabulary of the clitoric that would serve as a complement to all of the phallic imagery that we have, like from tall monuments in city centers, like the Washington Monument here in America. They take this phallic form. So where is the clitoric in culture, in visual culture and representation? So to talk about the clitoris is to talk about female sexual pleasure, that it's as valid as male pleasure, that it's a complement to it. It relates to this campus hookup culture that I was talking about, that in heterosexual hookup culture, the standard narrative is sort of penis in vagina male orgasm, the PIVMO sex that we call it. And that's often viewed like I tell students, close your eyes and imagine two people having sex. Like sort of the standard cultural narrative is a man and a woman, the penis in the vagina, in a heteronormative perspective, right? And it's a form of sexual activity that leads quite reliably to male orgasm. It's good for male pleasure. But for women, most women are not reliably orgasmic through vaginal penetration alone. I think the statistics are something like 20-25% of women are reliably orgasmic just through vaginal penetration. But for the vast majority of women, you've got to engage the clitoris. The clitoral stimulation is what leads to most pleasure. So that's a discourse that's slowly growing, but is absent in much sex ed, in much standard porn, in much of the sort of mainstream, mainstream representations of sexuality. So I think we're seeing more of that, and that's a really
Mm.
important growing discourse that's part of this positive sexuality. If we're emphasizing mutuality of pleasure, quality of pleasure, we need to talk more about the clitoris.
Yeah, it's definitely like the way our education system programs us to talk about sex and think about sex and have sex. It's crazy, and it's like you mentioned earlier that we are kind of like going through this mass deprogramming in a way,
Mm-hmm.
just culturally. Could you talk a little bit about like the other factors that come into that in terms of like what we're programmed to find desirable, like race and
Mm-hmm.
sexuality
Mm-hmm.
and beauty standards?
We could discuss all of those aspects. I've talked just briefly. I mentioned racial, sort of intersection of racial issues and white supremacy and the white body or white beauty standards as counting sort of worldwide for traditional understanding of beauty. So there's the Black is Beautiful movement from the 1960s, from the earlier racial justice, civil rights era has been making the movement. Of course, whiteness does not define beauty, but that sort of colorism exists within communities of color also, a favoritism for lighter skin, or there's terms such as featureism and texturism that refers to a bias toward features or the hair texture that matches up with a traditional white norm of beauty. So there's a lot of intersections of this sort of body positivity with racial justice also. Disability justice, very important here. And it's something that we are seeing more and more in companies. Underwear companies do this a lot, for example, because they use models who are less clothed to advertise underwear, undergarments. And so there has been a movement toward plus size models and real models, like not professional models, just real people, and people who have disabilities of various sorts, modeling underwear. It might be people of size, it might be someone in a wheelchair, someone with dermatological conditions, people with amputees. So talking about the diversity of the body, the sense that all bodies are good, that there's a goodness to all bodies. So there's a disability justice intersection here with the body positivity and the positive sexuality that I'm talking about. I think the issue of age is also very important, and something that you brought up earlier. There's a bias, sort of a stigma against the idea of older people having a full and active sexuality. The notion that somehow sexiness and beauty is the province of the young, and that this is actually a point that challenges my students the most, because they're hugely diverse in all sorts of ways, except they're all young. They're all 18 to 22. And one way that I can freak them out is by telling them, like, imagine your parents, your grandparents having sex, right? And that will pretty reliably freak them out. Maybe because it's just within their family, but just the idea of older people having sex, being full sexual citizens, entitled to their sexual citizenship. That's still sort of an area that has taboo around it in culture, right? So thinking about expanding our sense of sexual justice to include like the full sexual citizenship of older people, also the beauty of the older body. As an older woman, postmenopausal woman myself, it's something that I'm coming to think about more and more. The body changes, but there's a beauty to tracking those changes, also to embracing them, to not trying to fight them, but to moving with, thinking about that beauty of older life, a type of wisdom, ideally a sense of comfort in your body that can develop acceptance as you get old. So there's all sorts of intersections there around issues of the body and embodiment. It's not easy having a body. It's a sort of a strange thing to say, but it's a difficult thing to be embodied. And sexuality is some of the like the messiest, most high risk aspect of human embodiment. We're very vulnerable in our sexuality, right? We're often naked and open hearted and with someone else in intense, powerful moments. So there's risk and great potential for pleasure and connection, intimacy with another. So it's a powerful aspect of embodiment, being human.
Yeah. And on like a practical level, how do you think anyone from any group that's seen as like other in terms of beauty standards, how do people go about deprogramming that kind of like idea that they don't fit into the norm, that they're not sexy or desirable because they don't fit this like very narrow standard of beauty? Like obviously it's important to talk about it and it's so good that we're all talking about it, but like in reality, how does that translate into like how we feel in our everyday lives and like in our sexual interactions with people?
Well, according to my students, it's all happening on TikTok. Maybe that's like a bit of an exaggeration. The social media, I think of the younger generation as really riding a wave in this way. In America now, recent polls show that 1 out of 5 of our Gen Z demographic, young people like 18 to 22, are identifying as LGBTQ now, in the queer community in one way or another. So there's more openness and diversity in that young demographic among young adults. And so I'm very interested in the social media that they use as a way to connect with each other and to try out new ideas. I'm not a very techie person myself. Like doing this podcast with you is pushing me to my technological ability. Apparently, so I'm not on TikTok. The body positivity influencers, my students share this material with me all the time. Like that's where they find inspiration, and it is a double-edged sword. That social media can be where they get a lot of imagery of the perfect body, and you can use all these sorts of filters to Photoshop, to face tune yourself to make you look better online than you actually do. So that there can be negative pressures there around body positivity, but there's also this community of people who are willing to be real and open and vulnerable and share and create community around that I think is really transformative also. So I'm hearing a lot. I got to get on TikTok is what I'm hearing a lot from my students. That is like, if you're looking for practical spaces in the culture to make change, to create more space, more openness, more inclusivity and sense of acceptance. I'm interested in youth media. I think that's where I'd look.
Yeah, I do think that, like, in a weird way, even though social media and things like TikTok have now given us access to so many people, that can include, as you said, like the perfect life and the perfect body, and it gives you access to all this like FOMO, essentially, like fear of missing out, and like, oh, everyone's life is better than mine. But there's also, like, I think especially on TikTok, like I think TikTok realistically like might be like the real beginnings of it, but it's like it's given space to a lot of like relatability as well, because then you can find people that look just like you and are talking about things that you can relate to, or like problems that you've had, and then it kind of like, I don't know, I guess it's sort of like helping normalize a lot of different types of people, different types of bodies, different types of like sex, and just normalizing the whole like conversation about sexuality as well, because there is this openness.
Yeah, that's very important. That normalizing diversity of representation, you got to see it to be it, to know that that's what you can be and do also. I think it's sort of like the Me Too movement in that way. That when the Me Too movement started, and Harvey Weinstein in Hollywood, and these accusations against very powerful men, people in positions of power in the entertainment industry and politics and various business realms, then it becomes the safety in numbers, right? There's a just a flow of people saying that happened to me too. I know what you're talking about, and the more people do it, the more there's this sense of safety in numbers and support and a community that you know you're not alone. That's really important. And just breaking silence to be able to speak your truth, speak your story, see it represented out there, know that other people have shared the same experience, breaking that taboo. That like, we're just going to sweep this under the rug and we're going to stay silent about it, that somehow shame comes on you for having suffered abuse or harassment also. So taking away all of that and having this community of discourse, that's what I think is the most powerful thing about this new gender and sexual revolution that I'm seeing. And it's partly because of social media that enables so many people to participate in a discourse and to find community. So there's more conversation in the public sphere around issues of diversity and inclusion and justice than I think ever before. And again, it's not to say we're in any sort of paradise here. There's a lot of backlash that comes from all of that openness of discourse also. And the backlash can be very painful. But there is, I think, conversation and community and a sense of removing the shame and taboo and having this open space. On my good days, it makes me feel very hopeful about a positive direction for society.
What have you identified in your conversations with your students that are like the major problems in how sexuality is being discussed online?
Well, online, I guess there's two issues there that are important that come to mind. One is pornography, available in the space of the internet. So pornography is vastly more accessible than it ever was, precisely because of the internet. It can be like, pretty much all the students talk about how they were inadvertently first exposed to porn, like in middle school or something, as early teenagers. Someone older shared it with them or laughingly said, "Look at this, isn't this weird?" Or you can even stumble upon it, like on your phone, on computers and such. I think it's very important that we have literacy about pornography. So to teach young people porn literacy, to talk in critical ways about, like, for parents to have these conversations with their kids and for schools to talk to students about this, the omnipresence of porn, how porn does not represent it's not realistic depictions of sexuality. It's this fantasy factory. And I'm not anti-porn in any absolute way. I think there is a lot of demeaning porn, unhealthy porn that is often oppressive to women or minorities, but there can be ethical porn and slow porn, artistic porn, queer porn, feminist porn, alternative porn. I think those are all interesting. We're not going to get rid of porn. It's not going to disappear. But I think it's very important that we have open, critical conversations about pornography with young people. And the sort of flip side of that, or related to it, is the need for comprehensive, high quality sexuality education. And I think the UK does a better job than the US. I know that you have SRE, sexuality and relationship education, in school, and it's always, I like that the R is there, the relationship. That it's not, in America they talk about sex ed, but sex should not be abstracted from relationship education, right? That ultimately, I mean, there is solo sex. There's nothing wrong with masturbation. It's a good way to get to know your body. But otherwise, most sexuality is about relationship, or is in the context of relationships. So how to have healthy, intimate relationships is really what we're teaching, what we should be teaching young people. And sexuality is part of healthy, intimate relationship. But sex ed ideally includes things like communication skills and self-advocacy and negotiation and refusal skills. And a lot of it is about knowledge of yourself. What are your interests, your desires, your boundaries, and how do you communicate that to a partner in the context of a healthy relationship? So thinking about the online spaces, I'd say better porn literacy and overall better sexuality and relationship education, which many of my students come to us, to University of Alabama, from universities all over the country and around the world, with just horrific stories of really bad sex ed in their middle and high school. Even now in the 21st century, these very shame-based sex ed programs involving, like the piece of tape. You know about the piece of tape that you put the piece of tape on your arm and you pull it off, and the more times you put the piece of tape on your arm and pull it off, the less the tape can stick to another piece of tape. And then girls tell me that this was the sex ed they had when they were like in high school. They are the no longer sticky piece of tape if they had sexual partners before marriage. So a very shame-based purity culture model of sex ed. Whereas meanwhile, the boys were learning about orgasms and ejaculation, so this is like gender segregated sex ed. So we need better sex ed, that's for sure.
Yeah, I mean, at least thank God we have it like nationwide, because imagine it was like how you guys have it like by state.
Yeah.
Like it must vary so much.
Yeah.
It does. Sex ed varies state by state across the United States, and then often within each individual school district, and then it can come down to the teacher that you have in the classroom. The sort of the joke in America is that it's the gym teacher, the PE coach, who gets stuck with teaching sex ed, and then there's that Mean Girls line that the gym teacher just says, "Don't have sex or you'll die." And that's sort of the core message. That many students really, they report, well, something along those lines. Yeah, we were told. It just like videos of gonorrhea in the eyeball and like very shame, fear, guilt, anxiety oriented messages about sex ed that maybe had something to do with uh, STIs and pregnancy and like unintended pregnancy, but that's about it.
And what are the things that you think definitely need to be in there that aren't in there, especially to do with like desire?
Well, a lot of it is, one thing we haven't talked about is about changing gender scripts, so more egalitarian gender scripts. So sex ed would talk about gender equality, would be based on egalitarian gender norms. And there we did talk about this in terms of girls' desire, letting girls know that their body is designed for pleasure. That's what the clitoris is there for, and their pleasure is not shameful, and it's not less important than than a boy's pleasure if they're interested in heterosexual relationships, if they're interested in lesbian relationships or bisexual or asexual relationships, how those are all important and valued and consistent with a notion of positive sexuality. So the message about girls and women is I think increasingly there. A very interesting growing cultural narrative is about boys who, in a way, despite, well, I guess maybe because of the gains of the women's movement and waves of second, third wave feminism, there's been vast expansion in possibilities of gender roles for women. So women can wear skirts, wear pants. Girls can be trained to be a nurse, trained to be a doctor. But the boys have still very much been put in what's called the man box and toxic masculinity rules. Still maintain really tight gender norms for boys. And I think it's just recently that we've been talking these notions about toxic masculinity and the new inclusive masculinity have entered more into cultural discourse. You hear more and more about that. And I think that's really interesting. So the guys in my classroom, they talk about this. A guy cannot very easily pull off wearing a skirt, maybe a kilt in Scotland. That's okay. But it's still more shameful, like for a guy to train to be a nurse on our campus. That's still a tricky thing for him to pull off. For a guy to cry, that's still a tricky thing for him to pull off. So that there's ways in which these man box rules is still really lock guys into a fairly narrow traditional set of gender norms, whereas girls and women have been able to push against those norms. There's still the glass ceiling, etc. How far can you push? Rape culture still creates limits. But I'm very heartened by this growing discourse that would certainly have to be in like the best comprehensive sex ed curriculum that we could imagine would include this discourse also about how there's more than one way to be a good man. Boys don't belong in a box. Restrictive gender rules for boys are really horrific forms of bullying. All of this man up, don't be a sissy, big boys don't cry. And then like I hate these lines about, like grow a pair and like you're acting like a wuss, a pussy, like this horrible shaming, man box bullying. My male students talk about this all the time as still a type of gender programming that it's like a form of harassment. It's how I see it. And it's no wonder that guys grow up confused about issues like consent, if they've been told by the culture in so many ways, like a real man doesn't take no for an answer. And a real man is a sexual player. And he's supposed to have a lot of sexual partners. That's part of the social status going along with this man box guy code. So those pressures are still very much there, but they're also opening up and there's more cultural discourse about them. The American Psychological Association came out with a really groundbreaking report just a few years ago. It was either in 2018 or 2019 about the psychological cost for boys of this man box set of gender norms and how there's a psychological toll taken on boys and men because of that is abusive. It's unnecessary. It's not conducive to the development of a full humanity, and it undercuts a notion of positive sexuality also. So there's more discourse about that. I think that's a really interesting new area that I would love to see more increasing opening up these man box rules, this new inclusive masculinity, and that is something we see. I don't know, like non-gendered clothing. The Paris Fashion Week just came out with this whole line of sort of asexual, non-gendered clothing, and it's pushing boundaries. Like the dude skirt. You do see my students say you can't pull it off in Tuscaloosa, Alabama, but in the streets of New York or Los Angeles or London, I'm sure one can start to push these boundaries. The Harry Styles look, on the cover of Vogue. So not just for a celebrity to be able to pull it off, but other people too. There's a trickle down, that opening up of gender norms.
Great. Is there anything else that you think is really important to kind of like highlight in this conversation around like good sex and pleasure and desire going forward in terms of what you think the movement needs to be mindful of?
I think it's okay. I'd like to minimize anxiety around this. I see there's a moment of cultural change here, and change can be scary, right? It's not necessarily, particularly for older generations, not what you grew up with. And that can feel scary. It can feel like a lot of change all at once. I was passing some people at a cafe a while ago, and I heard this woman an older woman talking to people she was at. She said, "My niece just came out as polyamorous. What does that even mean? What does this mean nowadays? People suddenly are polyamorous." And so there's this sense of change, and it can be scary. But from what I'm seeing, and the argument that I'm making here is this new gender and sexual revolution. Sometimes I call it a manifesto about sexuality, is representing very positive change. It's very much in line with notions of strong civil society, democracy. The American foundational notion of the pursuit of happiness is very central to American democracy, creating space for equity, inclusion, normalizing diversity. Diversity is okay. Nature delights in diversity. It's okay. This is a good thing for society to make more room, more space, to get people out of boxes. People don't belong in boxes. And it doesn't mean the slippery slope to anything goes and all hell breaks loose and there's, I don't know, anarchy on the street. This good sex that I'm talking about, there's this strong ethical substratum here of the informed consent underlying everything, so that mutuality and respect is at the foundation of it. So I'd say let us have faith in our younger generation and trusting this movement toward openness and gender, sexual justice. I think it's getting us to a very positive space.
I mean, we clearly are hopeful, since we're trying to bring like these conversations forward and like normalize and diversify, I guess, the things that we talk about and the things that are on the table, if you will. So yeah, we're like with you in the hope.
Yeah, definitely. Great. Okay, do you want to tell people where they can find your book?
Internationally and within the US, probably the easiest way is to buy it online. It's available in the big online book sellers. It's published through Indiana University Press, an academic press, but it's meant as a trade book for a general audience. So it's full of pictures and illustrations and sidebars and pull quotes. It doesn't have a heavy academic apparatus, so the references are all at the end. There's not like footnotes, endnotes throughout the text. So it's meant to pull readers in and be a very accessible book for a general reader who's interested in these changes in the culture, wants to learn, wants to think, and you can get it, Amazon, Barnes & Noble, Indigo, Chapters, like the big online booksellers.
Okay.
And I'd be delighted to hear from readers and have conversation ongoing.
Yeah. Great. Yeah, hopefully everyone go check it out. I really enjoyed reading it. So yeah, I think it's a really great resource for people to kind of understand this area a bit more.
Thank you.
Okay, another massive thank you to Catherine for joining us. We learnt so much from her, as we said. And yeah, we hope you guys go check out her work, check out her social media, her website and everything. And yeah, we're going to keep having conversations about pleasure and desire. We have more great guests in the rest of our mini-series, so you should definitely go check that out and go check out all our other episodes. We're like nearly at 100 episodes. It's kind of crazy.
Yeah, God.
So yeah,
so much content for you guys to just binge. Go on. What's stopping you?
Yeah. So yeah, stay tuned. Make sure you subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. Go join our Patreon at Sextras Podcast to get access to loads of extra content. Find us on social media at Sextras Podcast. It's like TikTok, Facebook, Instagram. And you can find all our episodes and all of this information on our website, www.sextraspodcast.com.
Go check it out.
We'll see you very soon. Bye.
You've been listening to Sextras, presented by Honey Jane Wyatt and Maria Jose Hayodatiyi. Produced by Mabel Productions.